it's great to have you here. And what I'd like to do is just talk you through a few things about the course that we do, or the module, the global economy. And then if you do have questions, you're very welcome to ask as we go along. So let's talk then about the nature of the module. And if you have some questions, either feel free to raise your hand or pop the questions in the chat box. So the module that I'll be leading next year is called the Global Economy. And if we look at that, it features in two pathways, something that Luis was mentioning just earlier. It can either be in the business pathway or the finance pathway. If you have questions about those pathways, you want more detail about them, Luis might be the best person to talk to. But you can see there that in each of those pathways, the global economy module features. So what's in that module? Well, here are just some of the topics that we explore as we go through the module. Obviously, the first one is, what is economics? So I think this is an important issue to raise, because it doesn't matter if you haven't studied economics before. If you have studied some, no problem, that's great. But if you have no knowledge of economics, it's not a problem, because we will be starting right at the beginning by asking what the nature of economics is. And then some of the issues, or some of the other questions that we'll be exploring in the module are these. How do markets work? How are prices formed in an economy? How do you measure how well an economy is doing? So we might look at measures, things like GDP growth and unemployment and inflation. A big question we're asking is, why are some countries rich? Why are some countries poor? How can they develop over time? What are the characteristics of developing countries, and why do nations engage in trade with each other? We'll be looking as well at how patterns of trade are recorded over time, why exchange rates are determined in the way they are, why they fluctuate and why they change, what role multinational corporations have in the global economy. And we'll also be looking at how institutions like the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund are involved in individual countries, or indeed in the context of the World Trade Organization, setting rules about the way in which trade is undertaken. So those are some of the questions that we'll be exploring in the module, and they're just a few of them. So what I thought I would do today, when talking about the global economy, I thought I'd look at it through the lens of this simple question. What does the production of a simple t-shirt tell us about globalization? So I want to take you through how a t-shirt is actually made. I chose that product because it's one that we all likely have in our wardrobes. And then at the end of this short talk, I want to ask, what does it tell us about the nature of globalization? So before I actually talk a little about the way in which a t-shirt is made, could you please just put in the chat box any word that comes to mind when you see that word globalization? What do you think of when you see the word globalization? If you could put your first thoughts in the chat box, that would be great. And I can see what your thoughts are. Okay, so the way in which globalization can be thought of is this. I got this from a definition from a standard economics textbook, and it's saying that it's a term referring to the integration of the world's markets in goods and services, as well as flows of investment and people across national boundaries. We'll be looking at the way in which the global economy has become more integrated and more connected over time. And I can see, actually, it's great. I can see some contributions. Carbon footprint is one issue that's been raised, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The word exchange, that's brilliant. That is something that we're going to focus on a little bit later. One more question to you before I start talking about this issue of what the production of a simple t-shirt tells us about globalization. Could you just vote for me in the chat box, just with a single letter, or you can type the name of the country if you want. Which of those countries do you think is the largest exporter of cotton in the world? So you can just type in the letter A, B, C, or D, or you can put the name of the country in the chat box as well. Just let me know which one you think it is. Okay, so of the nominations I have so far, Brazil, I've got United States, China. Okay, so we're getting a variety of responses to that question. Really interesting. So there's quite a broad spread there. What I've actually done is I've put the countries in order of which are the largest producers in the world. So they're ranked in the order of China being the largest producer of cotton in the world, all the way down through India to Brazil to the United States. But two of you have correctly identified that United States is in fact the largest exporter of cotton in the world. So countries like China and India may well be consuming a large amount of the cotton that they produce for themselves, for their own domestic consumption. But it is in fact the United States that is the largest producer of cotton in the world. And you can see that here. So what I want to do is take us through the journey of the production of a t-shirt around the world. So we start in the United States, and here I've just chosen a picture of a typical farm from Mississippi in the United States. What you'll notice about the production in that country is it's what we call very capital intensive. And as economists, what we mean by the word capital is tools, machinery, and machinery. So it's highly mechanized and highly automated, and you have very expensive pieces of capital equipment. So this cotton picker is $850,000. And of course, this is complemented, this high-tech machinery, with fertilizers and pesticides. And the seeds, the origin of where our t-shirt starts, they are now genetically modified, and they're designed to be resistant to herbicides and pesticides. If you went back 30 years, none of the cotton seeds would have been genetically modified, but now the 90% of them are genetically modified, leading to much higher yields than would have been possible in the past. So once our cotton has been planted and harvested, as I say, using quite high-tech machinery, it's baled together. And all of those techniques together, the seeds, the fertilizers, the high-tech equipment, has led to a rise in yields per acre over time. And although this data doesn't capture all of it, since 1950, the cotton yields in the US have increased by more than 3 times. And that's the result of these advances in technology. And a single cotton farm, well, how many t-shirts can it produce? A single cotton farm per year in America is able to grow enough for the production of 9 million t-shirts. So this is where our journey starts in the United States. And that cotton is then shipped halfway around the world over here to Indonesia. And why it's shipped to Indonesia, I'll deal with a little bit later in the presentation. But again, it finds itself unprocessed at that point in a highly mechanized factory in Indonesia. $35 million of investment, and there it will be spun, stretched, twisted, and then it will become cotton thread. Notice again, though, this is what we call capital intensive production because it's done using automated processes using machinery. Not labor intensive, it doesn't involve huge number of workers, it's predominantly machine oriented. And just out of interest, the amount of cotton thread that you will need to make a single t-shirt is 9 kilometers of cotton thread. So it then leaves Indonesia and then will end up in a country like Bangladesh. And there you'll see in a moment that the nature of production is not capital intensive, not predominantly done by machines, but predominantly what we call labor intensive. So the thread is turned into fabric and it's dyed. That is capital intensive. But then the assembly of the shirt, its stitching, and indeed its finishing is done predominantly by labor. And Bangladesh has approximately 4 million people involved in its garment industry. And the people in the garment industry, many of them, and predominantly 90% women, leave rural areas of Bangladesh to move towards cities where garment production is undertaken. And they move motivated by a desire to escape extreme poverty. But as you can see here, this is a graph of minimum wages per month across Asia. And you've got Australia at the top here, but very much down toward the bottom end, you can see that there is Bangladesh. So even though those people are leaving areas of extreme rural poverty and moving to the city, they are still some of the world's lowest paid workers. But the siting of garment production in Bangladesh, it does open up opportunities for job creation. And as you'll see here, 90% of Bangladesh's exports come from the garment industry and the footwear industry combined. So not only is it a potential source of employment, it's also a potential source of export revenues for Bangladesh. Our t-shirt then is going to find its way back from Bangladesh all the way back to the United States. How does it do this? Through being shipped on a container. And you may well have seen containers like this, and they may seem rather unremarkable. They're just large metal boxes. But those containers were responsible for a dramatic rise in international trade. They were actually invented by someone called Malcolm McLean, who was an American, and in the 1950s he owned a trucking company. And he found it very frustrating to be able to transport goods or to get the goods off ships and onto trucks because it took so long. And I'll show you in a moment what he did. But let me just tell you as well that our t-shirt, once it leaves Bangladesh, approximately 80,000 of those t-shirts can be put into a simple container. And coming back to what I was saying earlier, the reason that Malcolm McLean, the person who invented the shipping container, was so frustrated was it could take in 1937 a week or more. It could take weeks to actually load or unload a ship. It's a very time intensive operation. Malcolm McLean designed the shipping container, and now these days the contents of a ship can be unloaded within a matter of hours. And that dramatically reduced the cost of being able to ship goods around the world. But there's something else about the shipping container that's remarkable. When Malcolm McLean designed it, he didn't design it with the intention of just thinking about what would fit onto a ship easily. Remember, he owned a trucking company. A standard size shipping container will fit quite easily, well, will fit, it's designed to fit onto a truck. It fits also onto a train, and there are even planes now that are designed to be able to carry a shipping container. It was something that really revolutionized international trade. So our t-shirt finds its way back to the United States. And what's remarkable is that 20,000 mile journey for each t-shirt, it can amount to just under $1. So remarkably inexpensive to transport that good, to transport that simple t-shirt around the world. So we've had a think about what it is or what the nature of production is for a simple t-shirt, but what lessons can we draw about the nature of globalization in having explored how a simple t-shirt is produced? I think there are six key points. There could have been more that I could have explored, but I had to make a choice. And so I ended up thinking, well, what are the six main points that I would like to think about through the medium of this simple example? The first point I'd like to think about, and many of these points that I'm about to raise are ones that we explore in the module at Warwick, the global economy module. The first one is that countries tend to specialize in activities in which they have what's called a comparative advantage, an advantage compared to other countries. And by the way, it's not just countries that can have a comparative advantage. Regions of a nation can have advantages over other regions. Different individuals can have advantages over others. So we tend to specialize in those activities in which we have an advantage compared to others, which economists, in very simple terms, call a comparative advantage. So thinking about that simple t-shirt then, why was it, or why is it that the cotton is grown in the United States? Well, it's using high-tech machinery, it's using fertilizers, pesticides, advanced GM technology to be able to produce that cotton. And because it has those methods of production, it is able to produce that cotton at very low cost. And moving over to Indonesia, it's able to invest in capital equipment, but the nature of specialization for a country like Bangladesh is still relatively labor intensive. And countries, their advantages can change over time. So sometimes we talk about comparative advantages as being created um, or existing naturally. Perhaps you have a climate that allows you to be able to grow cotton, or advantages can be acquired as well. So if you're able to invest in expensive capital goods, remember we mean by that advanced technologies or tools, then those advantages can be acquired. You can also acquire advantages as a country by training your workers. So we can see from this simple example of the production of a t-shirt then that that countries are specializing in goods or services in which they have a comparative advantage. This is something that was first mentioned by an economist called Adam Smith, who's widely regarded as this founder of modern economics. He talked about the division of labor, namely dividing labor up within a factory. That's the first example. He said that you could divide labor up within a factory and individual workers could specialize in tasks at which they are efficient, at which they are good. But we can expand that now. We're not just talking about how you can specialize within a factory. We're talking about how nations can specialize, how labor can be divided internationally. So it's called an international division of labor, where labor is starting to specialize nationally in those industries in which it has a comparative advantage. So that's the first lesson I think we can draw from the simple analysis of the production of a t-shirt across the globe. The second thing to make explicit is that in an era of globalization, the supply chain is highly integrated. And one advantage of that is that we can now have goods that are produced very inexpensively. If countries can exploit their comparative advantages and engage in those activities in which they have a cost advantage, that's great for all of us because the goods that are produced are cheaper than they might otherwise have been. But and this will have been made very apparent during the pandemic, it makes us vulnerable to any breakdown in the supply chain. So what have we said so far? Countries specialize in those goods of which they have a comparative advantage, and that the nature of the supply chain now is global rather than just local or national. The third thing that we can say is that multinational corporations, so corporations that have a presence across many nations, now account for 2/3 of international trade. And in my simple example of the t-shirt, a company like Bayer is involved in developing genetically modified seeds. The Danish company Maersk is just one example of a global shipping company. And these fashion retailers, Primark, H&M, Matalan, and Walmart, also have an international presence. And of course, it is they who are triggering the outsourcing of production across different countries. A fourth thing, and I've mentioned this through the container example, this process of containerization, together with developments in IT and internet and global telecommunications, has led to a dramatic fall in both communications costs and transport costs. That makes it feasible now. It's possible to be able to transport goods across the world relatively inexpensively. Prior to these cost reductions in transport, found that production was more oriented around the local or the national economy. The fifth thing that I want to pick up on is this. Nobody is in control of that production of a t-shirt. There is no one sitting in a headquarters like this one here. There is no government organizing the production of a t-shirt. It's all decentralized. Now that may seem unremarkable. And something like a t-shirt is something that's relatively simple to produce. But when you think about it in more detail, I've just put here a list of different characteristics of a t-shirt. And well, let's put one together. We could choose from all of these characteristics to make one that is unisex, that it's classic in design, is medium size, 100% cotton, it has a V-neck shape, has a short sleeve, and I'm going to choose the color blue because it's my favorite color. Now, that's just one combination of these different attributes that could exist. But when you work it out, there are actually, just with this simple product, 45,000 different combinations of t-shirt that could be made. So even with a product that's unbelievably simple in nature, working out what should be produced, for whom, by when, is actually remarkably complicated. Yet, no one is in control. There is no single person saying what should be done, when, or where, and there's no government telling people what to do. This remarkably complex process was something that was talked about by the Nobel Prize winning economist Friedrich Hayek. And he talked about through markets, and I know we've not really talked about that much today, but it is something that features a lot in our global economy module, through markets where prices are formed and where people have self-interest to undertake particular actions. He talked about a spontaneous order occurring because people respond to incentives. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just one moment. But to take this quote here, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. The point he's trying to make is this, that individuals may have grand ambitions to organize and create things. Governments may have aspirations to do things, but even something as simple as the creation of a t-shirt is remarkably complex if you're going to get it right, if you're going to get the right t-shirt to the right people at the right time at a price that they're willing to pay. And so he talked about the power of market economies driven through self-interest to be able to bring about what he called a spontaneous order. Now, I mentioned just a few moments ago that in a decentralized system like this, or a decentralized process where no one is in control, people are responding to incentives. So when I talk you through that simple example of making a t-shirt, well, what incentives were being responded to? Well, if we take a company like H&M or any other fashion retailer, their incentive obviously is to have garments produced at the lowest possible cost. So they will be incentivized to search out opportunities or factories or companies that are able to do that for them at the lowest possible cost. Why is shipping used? Why not air freight? Why not more transport by road? Because it's the cheapest way in which to do so. So companies are finding, or companies who need to transport goods are finding the least cost method of production. Why does our farmer in America use expensive $850,000 cotton pickers? Or why do they use GM seeds when they could possibly buy other seeds that are much cheaper? Because it's worth it for them, because the yield that they get from using these production techniques is very high relative to the amount that they need to spend on them. Why does our factory in Indonesia use capital intensive methods to create the thread? Because it's the cheapest way to do so. And why are workers from Bangladesh moving from rural areas to cities? Because they're incentivized by the possibility of being able to make higher wages. So when Friedrich Hayek talked about spontaneous order, what he meant was in responding to signals, price signals or wage signals that are generated in markets, that the process of coordination can take place without any single person being in charge. The last thing that I want to pick up on, actually, just before the last thing, I've just said people are responding to incentives. But I did say earlier that these are incentives that are very much driven by self-interest. And a huge question that we need to think about is whether those are the best incentives and whether actually governments should be involved in some way. There are huge moral and ethical issues here as well. Concerns have been raised about the safety of genetically modified crops. I haven't mentioned at all the environmental impact of the shipping of those garments, or indeed the disposal of those garments when people choose to get rid of them. I haven't talked about the working conditions and the safety standards of those workers in Bangladesh. And we can debate. I said it was an opportunity for job creation in Bangladesh and an opportunity for Bangladesh to earn export revenue. But we can debate whether it's exploitation rather than providing an opportunity to escape poverty. And we haven't mentioned the topic of child labour. And when you buy your garments in a shop, there is a lack of transparency. How much do you know about exactly what happened in the creation of any garment that you buy in a shop? So whilst markets do generate incentives, whether they are the best incentives or whether they are what we might hope for, is a question that's open to debate. Finally, and this is the last issue that I want to raise, I've mentioned during the talk that yields, for example, in the United States of cotton have been rising over time. When economists talk about productivity, we're really asking how much output, and so in this context, output might be cotton, can be created from a given amount of labor. Well, the good news is this: productivity has been rising, not just in the cotton industry or the garment industry, but in multiple industries across the world in recent times. And I'll give you more context in what I mean by recent times in a moment. Why is productivity rising? Well, it's rising for some of the reasons that we pointed out earlier. New technology, efficient machinery, people being equipped with education and skills, people specializing more, and better management. All of these things over time, or even with slow and incremental improvements, all of these changes are creating remarkable improvement in how much we're able to do with our scarce resources. I showed you earlier how much cotton yields had increased in the United States, but it's also true in China. In fact, the improvement in cotton yields in China is very dramatic compared to that in the United States. But here's the key point. It's not just happening in one particular location or two locations or in one particular industry. Broadly, productivity is rising um, over time and in a sustained way over long periods of time. I mean, for example, in the United Kingdom at the moment, one issue that we're debating is actually why productivity appears to be very weak at the moment. But if we look over long periods of time, there's been remarkable progress in productivity over time. In fact, here's a quote from another Nobel Prize winner, Professor Paul Krugman, where he says, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. A country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker. And again, this is another question to which we return in the module. What is it that countries can do to raise their productivity? How can they push themselves out of poverty? And how is it that we can ignite a change in productivity? So the last thought that I really want to leave you with today, and I'm very happy to take some questions in a moment, is this. I want to remind you that productivity has increased in recent decades, or in fact, in the last couple of 100 years, really quite dramatically. And I want to leave you with this chart here. Why do I think that chart is so interesting or so important? It tells us about income per person, or another way of expressing that is GDP per capita. For most of human history, people have lived in abject poverty. But since the predominantly the Industrial Revolution, you can see here how dramatically living standards have changed. And that really fundamentally is down to increases in productivity. It's quite a complex question to try and understand what causes rises in productivity. But the key point that I wanted to leave you with today is that, and I don't deny for a moment that there are huge problems of inequality, huge environmental challenges that we face. But you do actually live in a remarkable period of history whereby changes in living standards have grown very dramatically. So that concludes my talk about what we can learn about the process of globalization through the medium of the production of a simple t-shirt.